The city of Kiev lifts weekend curfew. Residents of the Ukrainian capital allowed to leave underground shelters. Students advised to make their way to the railway station for onward journey to the western parts. Russia's central bank hikes key interest rate to 20%, up from 9.5% to counter risks of ruble depreciation and high inflation. Long queues of Russians seen outside ATMs after worries that Western sanctions on Russian banks could trigger shortages of cash and disrupt payment systems. Latvian parliament authorizes its citizens to fight in Ukraine if willing, becoming the first country to do so. This is after Zelensky appealed to foreign nationals to help Ukraine defend herself. Well, today is the fifth day since Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine, and the Ukrainian military has said that Russian troops had slowed down the pace of the offensive. Before we begin with the details, let's quickly take you or get you the top developments at this hour. Key issue of talks in Belarus is immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of troops from Ukraine. We do know that well, today is the fifth day since Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine, and the Ukrainian military has said that Russian troops had slowed down the pace of the offensive. Before we begin with the details, let's quickly get you the top developments at this hour. Russia and Ukraine will be holding talks at the Chernobyl exclusion zone shortly. Composition of Ukrainian delegation at talks in Belarus is not disclosed, but it is reported to be rather high level. Russian delegation has confirmed that Russia is interested in finding way to agreement with Ukrainian delegation as soon as possible. Ukraine President's office says its main goal of talks with Russia is immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian troops, although earlier Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that he did not believe in the outcome of the meeting. Belarus said that the venue for the talks is now prepared.
Скажу відверто, як завжди, я не дуже вірю в результат цієї зустрічі, але нехай спробують. Щоб потім у жодного громадянина України не було жодного сумніву, що я, як президент, не намагався зупинити війну, коли був нехай і маленький, але все ж таки шанс.
Now, according to reports, Russia's defense ministry says its forces have taken control of Ukrainian cities of Berdyansk and Enerhodar, and Russian troops have also taken over area around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Russian army says civilians can leave freely from Kiev if they so wish, adding that Ukrainians are using civilians as human shields, and also claims air superiority in Ukraine. Reports say Russia has lost about 5,300 troops since the invasion began. Blanket curfew that had been imposed in Kiev for the past 3 days has now been lifted, allowing students to move westward through trains. Blasts were reportedly heard in Ukrainian capital of Kiev in the early hours on the fifth day of the siege. And more on the situation in Ukraine, my colleague Mohammed Saleh spoke with Svitlana Zalischuk, and this is what she had to say.
Ms. Zalischuk, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us. It is a very difficult time, you understand, in Ukraine because of what Ukraine has been witnessing over the last 5 days. But firstly, I want you to weigh in terms of the talks that are scheduled to be held between the Ukrainian delegation and the Russian delegation. How is Ukraine approaching these talks?
Ukraine always insisted on diplomacy, but we define diplomacy as a dialogue and not surrender. And as a Ukrainian who speaks both Ukrainian and Russian, and as a Ukrainian whose grandparents are Russian ancestors, so my grandparents are from Russia, I want to tell you that I feel a Ukrainian citizen. And it is ugly for me, even a suggestion that a perspective or a chance for peace should be taken from a Russian perspective, that when Putin demands that Zelensky should go, this is just unacceptable. I want to assure you that it's up to Ukrainian population to choose our own presidents. Ukraine cannot and will not concede with its territorial integrity, with its sovereignty. So I'm also very skeptical with regards to potential talks, because what Putin is doing, he started this full-fledged invasion against a democratic country based on some manufactured and false basis, accusing that somehow the government of Ukraine is Nazi. I want to remind you that our president has a Jewish origin. Mm-hmm. So it sounds just ridiculous, if you want. And I want to say this, that more and more Putin resembles Hitler of our century. Such comparison used to be a taboo, but we need to make a legitimate exception for Putin. We were naive enough for too many years to allow him killing of his own journalists, civil society, political opposition like Navalny, also invade Georgia, create a real humanitarian crisis in Syria, interfere in elections around the world. It's time to stop Putin. Without exaggeration, today we decide how the next century will develop, and we either ensure peace and justice or encourage big bullying nations to assault their neighbors.
You know, just as we speak, Ms. Zalestyuk, the visuals of the venue which has gotten ready for the two delegations where they are supposed to meet, we are getting the visuals of the place where the two delegations, the Russian delegation and the Ukrainian delegation, will be sitting face to face. This meeting, of course, is being slated to be held in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Earlier, Belarus had suggested that the meeting could take place in Minsk, which was rejected by the Ukrainians, stating that Belarus is a nation that is complicit in the invasion of Ukraine. We'll, of course, be getting you the updates as they unfold in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. But Ms. Zalestyuk, I also want you to weigh in a little bit about what life has been like for the common people in Ukraine over the course of the last 5 days. We're given to understand that there's been heavy bombardment through missile strikes that the Russians have resorted to. The major cities in Ukraine have been surrounded by the Russian army, such as Kiev, Kherson, Kharkiv, and many others. What is life like for the common people there? Because there was also a state of complete curfew where no one was allowed to, in fact, step out of doors.
It's devastating. It's a big tragedy for every single Ukrainian, because we already lost several hundreds of civilians. You've probably seen some videos and pictures of civilian infrastructure being hit by missiles, like buildings in the center of the capital. We also have approximately 15 children killed and several hundreds of children are wounded. This is a real tragedy, but not only for Ukraine. I think it's a blow on humanness, on dignity, on human rights and human lives. That's why it is so important for the international community to stand up to Putin. We also have hundreds of thousands refugees now. It's like it's turning into a refugee crisis on the western border of the country. It's approximately 400,000 people left Ukraine. There are real big lines and crowds on the borders. People are trying to get out their small kids, babies from across the border because they don't feel safe. And you're right, there are curfews announced, imposed in many cities. So people also don't have access to medicine, to food, some of them to water. So it's a real difficult situation.
You know, the crisis of war quite often is the crisis of logistics. For people who are stuck in this war inside of Ukraine, you know, at this point of time, of course, everything goes into war effort, but common people will need to find access to food, to water and to medicines. How well stocked is Ukraine to be able to supply all of these for its common people?
Well, we were very well stocked 5 days ago before all this started. We were self-sufficient and prosperous country. You wouldn't feel different in Kyiv than in any other European capital, but you definitely feel now. I know that government is working very hard to create all this logistics as we speak. Just 10 minutes ago, before we started this conversation, I was approached by some people in the government to make sure that the trucks from abroad can have some fuels to bring some humanitarian help to Ukraine. So these questions are being resolved right now.
And also Russia, in the way it has gone about its strategy of carrying out these missile strikes, we're given to understand that it has very systematically chosen to target the critical infrastructure in Ukraine. It has targeted power stations, it has tried to target certain gas lines, it's also taken over a hydropower center in the south of Ukraine. Do all people in Ukraine at this point of time have access to electricity? There were reports of internet being down in some parts of Ukraine as well. Is internet connection back up?
Internet connection is working, as well as mobile connection. Some cities have been cut off the electricity, smaller cities in the east, in the south. But overall, if you're talking about the major territory, it's covered well with the heating and with electricity. So at this, at least, point, there is people don't suffer from that.
And also, do you think Vladimir Putin and the Russian war machine underestimated the resistance that would be put up by the people in Ukraine? Because from the information that is coming in, it appears that the Russian war machine has made very sluggish progress after the first day. How are Ukrainians approaching, the war that is unfolding even as we speak?
You're absolutely right. I think that Putin somehow thought that he will be welcomed here, or maybe he would have a victorious war in a couple of days. But it turned out for him to be a real humiliation and international isolation and loss of authority. They report that Putin already has lost thousands of his soldiers here, more than in any other conflict that Putin started since 1991. And they're afraid to report this data to the Russian population. Moreover, Ukraine created several sites where we publish the data about people that killed on our land or wounded or who surrendered, so that their mothers, their parents, have access to that information and would be able to get in touch with the Ukrainian government, either bring them back, bodies to be buried. But what we see, that Russians just blocked all that, inhuman to deny their own mothers to have a chance to bury their sons.